6 a.m., execution time. But at 5:47 a.m., the governor's phone rings. A prison warden is crying on the other end. "Sir, you need to halt this execution, right now." "Why?" "Because something just happened in the chapel, something impossible. We have 13 witnesses." His name was Shannon Bolton, a soldier the nation had already forgotten. Hours before they were going to kill him, he asked for nothing. No last meal, no mercy, no goodbye, just one request. "Let me see the Virgin Mary before I die." What happened in those final 15 minutes wasn't just a miracle. It was the exposure of a 7-year lie that sent an innocent Marine to death row while the real killer walked free in plain sight. And the man who finally told the truth? That's the part that will break your heart and heal it in the same breath. Stay with me until the end, because this story will break your heart and mend it in the same breath. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's begin. This is the story of Shannon Bolton, a decorated Marine whose final hours would prove that heaven still breaks through steel and shame. What you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about justice, honor, and the power of faith in the face of corruption. It's a story that transformed not just one condemned veteran, but every soul who witnessed what unfolded that October morning at 3 a.m. Shannon Bolton was 37 years old when the judge delivered his final sentence: death by lethal injection. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as those words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. In the back row of the gallery, a figure sat motionless in full Marine dress blues. General Joe Flacco had never missed a single day of Shannon's trial. He had watched every witness take the stand. He had listened to every piece of evidence presented. But on that day, even his military composure cracked under the weight of what he had just heard. The case against Shannon had been devastating. He was accused of killing a white police officer during a violent altercation outside a veterans bar. The evidence seemed ironclad. His fingerprints were found on the murder weapon. A witness claimed he had shouted threats moments before the shot rang out. The prosecution painted him as a PTSD-damaged killer who had snapped under pressure, a decorated war hero turned stone-cold murderer with no remorse and no path to redemption. His public defender, overwhelmed and inexperienced, barely mounted a defense. Shannon's combat trauma was twisted into evidence of aggression rather than pain. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before declaring him guilty. But Shannon had always maintained his innocence, even as the bailiff led him away in chains, even as the steel doors of death row slammed shut behind him, even as 7 long years stretched on with no hope of appeal. He never stopped saying the same thing. "I didn't shoot him. I tried to stop it." The truth was, Shannon's story had started long before that fatal night outside the veterans bar. He grew up in a neighborhood where survival meant carrying your faith like body armor, where every corner held memories of friends who didn't make it home. His mother, Rose Bolton, had raised him and his younger sister alone after his father was killed in a construction accident when Shannon was just 9 years old. Rose worked the night shift at a veterans hospital, cleaning rooms where men screamed in their sleep from wars that never ended. During the day, she took in laundry from the neighborhood just to keep food on the table. But every Sunday morning, no matter how exhausted she was, Rose would wake Shannon up before dawn for Mass. She would press his one good shirt, polish his shoes with newspaper and spit, walk him 8 blocks through the frost to St. Michael's Catholic Church, the same church where she'd married his father, the same church where she'd buried him 3 years later. In her purse, she always carried the same 3 items: a worn envelope with exactly enough money for the collection plate, a small vial of holy water blessed on Easter Sunday, and a sterling silver medal of the Virgin Mary that had belonged to her own mother, who had prayed it through 2 wars and the Great Depression. "Shannon," she would whisper to him as they knelt in the wooden pews, her calloused hand gripping his. "Remember that Our Lady never abandons her warriors. No matter what battles you face, no matter how dark the night gets, she is always watching over her soldiers." Those words would echo in Shannon's mind years later, during the firefights in Fallujah, during the nightmare months of PTSD that followed his return home, during the endless nights on death row when faith seemed like a language he'd forgotten how to speak. And they would echo one final time in a prison chapel, when a condemned Marine would kneel before a golden statue and the Virgin Mary would answer back. But before Shannon Bolton ever knelt in that chapel, before the miracle that would shake a prison to its foundation, There was a night that destroyed everything he'd built since coming home from the war. It was a Thursday in late March, unseasonably cold for North Carolina. Shannon had been back stateside for 14 months, working security at a warehouse distribution center and trying to silence the ghosts that screamed in his sleep. Twice a week, he'd meet up with a handful of other vets at Murphy's Tap, a dive bar 3 blocks from the Veterans Hospital where his mother still worked nights. They didn't go there to drink heavily or start trouble. They went there because it was the only place where they didn't have to explain why loud noises made them flinch, why they sat with their backs to the wall, why sometimes in the middle of a sentence they'd go quiet and drift somewhere else entirely. On that particular night, Shannon had been nursing the same beer for over an hour, listening to Corporal Denny Rodriguez tell a story about a dog they'd befriended in Ramadi. The bar was nearly empty, just the usual handful of regulars, the bartender, and one other person. Officer Marcus Hanlon. Hanlon was a 12-year veteran of the county police force, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, with the kind of face that wore authority like a mask. He'd been coming to Murphy's for months, always in plain clothes, always watching. The other vets had noticed. The way his eyes would linger on Shannon a beat too long, the way he'd position himself near the door whenever Shannon got up to leave. "Man's got a problem with you," Rodriguez had said more than once. Shannon had shrugged it off. He'd dealt with worse than small-town intimidation. But the truth was, Hanlon had been escalating. A shoulder check in the parking lot that was too deliberate to be accidental. Comments loud enough to be overheard about trained killers walking around like regular citizens. Questions to the bartender about what time the Marine usually showed up. That night, Shannon made the mistake of leaving alone. He'd said goodnight to Rodriguez and the others around 11:30, zipping up his jacket against the March wind as he pushed through the heavy door. The parking lot was poorly lit. Just 2 flickering street lamps casting long shadows across cracked asphalt. Shannon's truck was parked near the back fence, next to a dumpster that reeked of stale beer and rotting food. He was 20 feet from his vehicle when he heard the footsteps behind him. "Bolton!" Shannon stopped, his Marine training reading the threat before his conscious mind caught up. He turned slowly. Officer Hanlon stood 15 feet away, hands loose at his sides. He wasn't in uniform, but the badge clipped to his belt caught the streetlight. So did something else. The grip of a service weapon holstered at his hip. "Officer Hanlon," Shannon kept his voice level, non-threatening. "Something I can help you with?" "You can start by explaining what you were doing near the Riverside storage depot last Tuesday night." Shannon's jaw tightened. He'd been at the depot on legitimate business, meeting someone on behalf of General Flacco. A quiet favor for his former commanding officer. Nothing illegal, nothing that should have raised flags, but the way Hanlon said it, loaded with accusation, made it sound like a crime. "I had business there. Private business." "Private business." Hanlon took 3 steps closer. "That's funny, because I ran your plates. Sat there and watched you for 40 minutes, meeting with some guy in a black SUV, exchanging packages in the dark like a couple of drug dealers." "I'm not dealing drugs." "Then what were you dealing, Bolton?" Another step. "Because from where I'm standing, you look like exactly what you are. A killer the government trained and then dumped back on our streets. How many people did you kill over there? 10? 20? Shannon's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept them there, kept his breathing steady. This was a trap. He could feel it. "I think this conversation is over." He turned to walk away. "I'm not done talking to you, soldier boy." Hanlon's hand shot out and grabbed Shannon's shoulder, spinning him around with enough force to make him stumble. That was the first mistake. The second was reaching for his weapon. Shannon's combat reflexes took over before thought could intervene. He caught Hanlon's wrist as the officer's hand moved toward his holster, twisting it away in a disarming technique drilled into him by 1,000 hours of training. Hanlon threw a wild punch with his free hand. Shannon blocked it, pushed him back. "Don't do this," Shannon said, his voice hard now. "Just walk away." But Hanlon was done walking away. He charged forward like a linebacker, driving Shannon backward into the side of a parked car. The impact knocked the wind from Shannon's lungs. They grappled, Hanlon's forearm pressing against Shannon's throat, Shannon trying to break free without hurting the man. Then Shannon heard something that made his blood freeze. A car door opening. Footsteps. A voice barking orders. "Step back! Both of you! Step back now!" Shannon turned his head just enough to see a figure moving toward them from the shadows near the bar's side entrance. Before he could process who it was, Hanlon threw another punch that connected with Shannon's temple. Stars exploded across his vision. He dropped to one knee, and then the gunshot cracked through the night like thunder. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space of the parking lot, echoing off brick walls and metal fencing. Shannon's ears rang. He looked up, disoriented, and saw Hanlon staggering backward, his hand pressed against his chest. Blood, dark and spreading, seeped between his fingers. Hanlon's eyes went wide with shock. He opened his mouth, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. Then his knees buckled and he collapsed onto the asphalt, his head making a sickening crack against the pavement. "No!" Shannon scrambled forward, his hands already reaching for Hanlon's wound, pressure training from combat first aid kicking in. "No, no, no!" But it was too late. He could see it in the way blood pooled too fast, too dark. The way Hanlon's chest rose once, twice, and then didn't rise again. Shannon looked down at his own hands, now covered in another man's blood. And that's when he saw it. A weapon. Hanlon's service pistol lying on the ground less than 3 feet away. His fingerprints were already on it from when he'd grabbed Hanlon's wrist during the struggle. Behind him, the sound of running footsteps, shouting. Someone screaming for someone to call 911. Shannon looked up, searching the shadows for the figure he'd seen, the person who had actually fired the shot. But the parking lot was chaos now. Bar patrons pouring out, flashlights from cell phones cutting through darkness, Rodriguez running toward him yelling his name, and somewhere in that chaos, someone was already gone. The trial was a parade of lies wrapped in the language of justice. Shannon sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting suit, his court-appointed attorney shuffling papers nervously, while the prosecution built their case brick by damning brick. The first witness was a bartender from Murphy's Tap who testified that Shannon had been agitated that night, muttering to himself, exhibiting signs of extreme agitation and paranoia. None of it was true, but the jury leaned forward, taking notes. The second witness was a bar patron who claimed he'd seen Shannon and Officer Hanlon arguing inside the bar earlier that evening, that Shannon had threatened to handle this outside. Shannon's attorney objected weakly. The objection was overruled. The third witness was a forensics expert who testified that Shannon's fingerprints were found on the murder weapon, that gunshot residue was detected on his hands, that the trajectory of the bullet was consistent with someone of Shannon's height firing at someone of Hanlon's height. No one mentioned that Shannon had been trying to disarm Hanlon. No one mentioned the third person in the parking lot. When Shannon tried to explain, his own attorney advised him not to testify. "It'll only make things worse," the man had said, wringing his soft hands. "Your military record, the prosecution will twist it, make you look like a trained killer." They did that anyway. The prosecution brought in a psychiatrist who'd never met Shannon but had reviewed his military file. The man testified about PTSD, about how combat veterans sometimes experienced dissociative episodes, where they couldn't distinguish past from present, enemy from civilian. "Isn't it possible," the prosecutor asked, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "that when Officer Hanlon approached Mr. Bolton he experienced a flashback to Iraq? That he saw not a police officer, but an enemy combatant?" "It's certainly within the realm of possibility," the psychiatrist replied. Shannon's attorney didn't even cross-examine. Day after day, the narrative hardened like concrete. Shannon Bolton, decorated Marine Sergeant turned killer, a man the system had trained to kill and then failed to rehabilitate, a ticking time bomb who had finally exploded on a cold March night, taking an innocent officer's life. The only person who seemed to see through the performance was General Joe Flacco. He sat in the gallery every single day, arriving early, leaving late. Always in civilian clothes now, his face carved from stone, his eyes never leaving Shannon's face. When Shannon glanced back during testimony, searching for anything resembling support, Flacco's expression was unreadable. But there was something in those eyes, something that looked like guilt. Shannon tried to convince himself he was imagining it, that the stress of the trial was making him see things that weren't there. But as the days wore on, as the prosecution's web tightened around him, he became certain. Flacco knew something. On the final day after the jury had deliberated for less than 6 hours, they filed back into the courtroom with their verdict. Shannon stood, his legs shaking, as the forewoman read the words that would end his life. We, the jury, find the defendant, Shannon Marcus Bolton, guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupted. Someone screamed. Shannon heard his mother's voice crying out from somewhere behind him, a sound of pure anguish that would haunt him every night for the next 7 years. But Shannon was looking at General Flacco. The general sat perfectly still, his hands gripping the bench in front of him so hard his knuckles had gone white. His face had drained of all color, and as Shannon was led away by the bailiffs, wrists locked in handcuffs, Flacco's eyes followed him, not with pity, not with disappointment, but with something far worse: recognition, complicity, the look of a man watching another man pay for his sins. In that moment, Shannon understood, but understanding changed nothing. The system had already decided who would be sacrificed and who would walk free. The steel door closed behind him with the finality of a tomb sealing shut. And General Joe Flacco walked out of that courtroom into the afternoon sun, carrying a secret that would poison him for 7 long years. Death Row was a place where time moved differently, not faster or slower, but sideways, like a river that had forgotten which direction was downstream. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, months into years, and Shannon Bolton stopped counting somewhere around year 3. His cell was 8 feet by 10 feet, concrete walls the color of old bones, a steel toilet sink combination bolted to the floor, a cot with a mattress so thin he could feel every weld in the metal frame beneath, one small window, reinforced glass embedded with wire mesh, that showed him nothing but a rectangle of sky that changed from black to gray to black again. They kept him in administrative segregation. 23 hours a day in that cell. 1 hour in a slightly larger cage they called the rec yard, though there was nothing recreational about pacing in circles while guards watched from towers with rifles. For the first 2 years, Shannon tried to maintain the discipline the Corps had beaten into him. Push-ups until his arm shook, sit-ups until his abdomen cramped, mental exercises, reciting Marine Corps general orders, the rifleman's creed, anything to keep his mind sharp. But slowly, inevitably, the silence ate away at him. He started writing letters, long ones, to people who would never read them. To his mother, who had died of a heart attack 6 months after his sentencing, the grief literally stopping her heart in the middle of her shift at the hospital. To Rodriguez and the other vets from Murphy's Tap, though he had no idea where they were now. To General Flacco, letters filled with questions that started with why and how could you. He never sent any of them. They sat in a cardboard box under his cot, growing yellow with age, his handwriting becoming increasingly erratic as the years wore on. By year 4, the letters stopped making sense even to him. Fragments of thoughts, half-finished sentences, the mental equivalent of a radio signal breaking up in static. The chaplain started coming around year 3. Father Gabriel was a small man with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering to ever be truly surprised by it. He would stand outside Shannon's cell during visiting hours, speaking softly through the narrow slot where meals were delivered. "Shannon, I'm here if you want to talk." Silence. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But anger is a heavy thing to carry alone." Silence. "Your mother was a woman of great faith. She would want—" "Don't!" Shannon's voice, rough from disuse, cut through the cell like a blade. "Don't talk about her." Father Gabriel was quiet for a long moment. "All right, I won't. But I'll be back next week, and the week after that, for as long as it takes." He kept his word. Every Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock, Father Gabriel would appear outside Shannon's cell. Sometimes he would talk about the weather or the garden the trustees maintained in the prison yard. Sometimes he would read scripture, his voice a gentle cadence in the harsh acoustics of Block E. And sometimes he would just stand there in silence, a presence that said, "You are not alone, even if you want to be." Shannon never responded. By year 5, something inside him had calcified. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind something worse. Not rage, but a kind of hollow resignation, an acceptance that this was how his story ended. No miracle, no vindication, just a slow fade to black in a concrete box while the world forgot he'd ever existed. He stopped doing push-ups, stopped pacing, spent most of his waking hours lying on his cot, staring at water stains on the ceiling that looked like maps of countries that didn't exist. The guards noticed. "Bolton's given up," he heard one of them say during a shift change. "Can you blame him? 7 years in the hole. I'd lose my mind too." But there was one guard who seemed different. Henry Walsh was in his late 50s, a career corrections officer with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from a cliffside. Hard lines, gray stubble, eyes that revealed nothing. He worked the night shift in Block E, making his rounds every hour, the jangle of his keys announcing his approach long before he appeared. Walsh never spoke to the inmates, never engaged in the small talk or casual cruelty that some of the other guards used to pass the time. He simply did his job with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had long ago stopped thinking about what his job actually meant. But something changed in year 6. Shannon was lying on his cot one December night, watching his breath fog in the unheated cell, when he heard Walsh's keys approaching. The guard stopped outside his cell door. Shannon didn't bother looking up. These wellness checks were routine. The guard would look through the slot, confirm Shannon was alive, and move on. But this time, Walsh lingered. Shannon heard the scrape of something being pushed through the meal slot, then footsteps walking away. Curious despite himself, Shannon sat up. On the floor just inside his cell lay a small pamphlet cheaply printed on thin paper that had been folded many times. The cover showed a woman in blue robes, her hands outstretched, her expression serene. "The Rosary of Our Lady." Shannon stared at it for a long time. He hadn't thought about prayer in years. Hadn't thought about his mother's whispered promises in the pew at St. Michael's, or the silver medal she'd carried in her purse. Faith seemed like something from another life, from a version of himself that no longer existed. He almost threw the pamphlet away, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of his mother's voice. Maybe it was the sheer unexpectedness of this small kindness from a guard who had never shown him anything but professional indifference. Maybe it was just that the pamphlet was something new in a world where nothing ever changed. He picked it up. Inside were the words to the Hail Mary, instructions for praying the Rosary, and a full-page image of the Virgin Mary. Not the European Madonna of classical art, but something warmer, more human. Her skin was olive-toned, her eyes dark and knowing. She looked like she could have been his mother's sister, his grandmother, any of the women who had raised him with calloused hands and unshakable faith. Shannon ran his thumb across the image, feeling the cheap paper grain, and for the first time in 5 years he felt something other than emptiness. That night, lying in his cot while the cell block settled into its restless sleep, Shannon whispered the words printed in the pamphlet. "Hail Mary, full of grace." His voice cracked. He couldn't remember the rest. He tried again. "Hail Mary, blessed art thou." The words came slowly, like water from a long, dry well. But they came. For the first time since his mother's funeral, Shannon Bolton prayed. And in the shadows of Block E, guard Henry Walsh completed his rounds, unaware that he had just become the messenger of something far greater than himself. The man assigned to watch Shannon die had instead given him the one thing that could keep him alive. Hope. Prayer, Shannon discovered, was like a muscle he'd forgotten he had. Those first nights were clumsy, painful. He'd start the Hail Mary and lose his place halfway through. He'd try to remember the rhythm his mother had taught him and find only fragments. But he kept trying, night after night, whispering into the darkness of his cell, speaking to a God he wasn't sure was listening. The guards noticed the change before Shannon did. "Bolton's talking to himself again," one said during a shift briefing. "Nah, he's praying," another corrected. "I heard him during rounds last night, doing that Catholic thing with the beads." "He doesn't have beads." "Well, he's doing it anyway, moving his fingers like he's counting. Weird as hell." But it wasn't weird to Shannon. For the first time in 6 years, the silence of his cell didn't feel suffocating. It felt like sanctuary, a space where he could speak without judgment, without lawyers twisting his words, without prosecutors turning his pain into evidence. He prayed for his mother, for Rodriguez and the others from Murphy's, for Officer Hanlon's soul, even though the man had hunted him. And sometimes, in moments of desperate honesty, he prayed for General Flacco. Show him what he's done. Make him carry it, like I carry it. 3 months after Guard Walsh had slipped him the pamphlet, Shannon was assigned to chapel cleaning duty. This was rare for death row inmates, usually reserved for those the administration deemed non-violent. But the regular trustees were sick with flu, and the warden needed bodies. Shannon and 2 other death row inmates were shackled and escorted to the prison chapel on a gray February morning. The chapel was small, wedged between the administrative offices and the infirmary. Wooden pews that had been donated from a closed church in town. A simple altar, stained glass windows so old the colors had faded to ghosts of their former brightness. And in the corner, on a small pedestal, stood a statue of the Virgin Mary. Shannon stopped when he saw her. The guards tensed, hands moving to their batons, but Shannon wasn't moving toward her. He was just staring. The statue was old, probably as old as the chapel itself. Her paint was chipped, revealing white plaster underneath. Her hands were outstretched, palms up, in a gesture of welcome or surrender. And her face was peaceful. "Bolton, move along," one of the guards barked. Shannon moved, but his eyes stayed on the statue. As he swept the floor around the pews, he found himself drifting closer to her corner. When the guards were distracted, helping the other inmates move boxes, Shannon stood directly in front of her. He didn't kneel, couldn't, with the shackles and the guards watching. But he stood there, looking up into that chipped plaster face, and felt something he hadn't felt since before the trial. Warmth. Not physical heat, but something deeper. A sensation like sunlight on skin after years in shadow. A presence, gentle and knowing, that seemed to emanate from the statue itself. "You're not forgotten," the warmth seemed to say. "You're seen. Bolton, time's up. Back to your cell." The return to Block E felt longer than usual. The weight of the shackles heavier, the concrete walls grayer. But Shannon carried that warmth with him, a small ember in his chest that the darkness couldn't quite extinguish. That night, his prayers changed. Instead of reciting memorized words, he spoke like he was talking to someone real, someone standing in his cell, listening with infinite patience. "I don't know if you're really there," he whispered to the ceiling, to the darkness, to whatever might be listening. "I don't know if any of this means anything, but I felt you today, in that chapel, and His voice broke. "I need you to be real. I need this to mean something." Father Gabriel noticed the transformation during his next Wednesday visit. Shannon was sitting on his cot when the chaplain approached, not lying down. His cell, usually a chaos of scattered belongings, was neat, organized, and Shannon's face, while still gaunt and scarred by years of confinement, had lost some of its hardness. "Shannon," Father Gabriel said carefully, "you look different." "Do I?" "Yes." The priest studied him through the slot. "You look at peace." Shannon almost laughed at that. Peace, in a death row cell. But he understood what Father Gabriel meant. The bitter resignation had lifted. In its place was something else. Not happiness, not even hope exactly, but a quiet certainty that he wasn't walking this path alone. "Someone gave me a pamphlet," Shannon said, "about the rosary." Father Gabriel's eyebrows rose. "Did they?" "Started praying again. Been a while. Prayer has a way of finding us when we need it most." Father Gabriel's voice was gentle. "Your mother would be glad to know it." This time Shannon didn't flinch at the mention of her. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She would." The weeks that followed were different. Shannon prayed every night, sometimes for hours. The guards' gossip spread through the prison like wildfire. The Marine in Block E talked to someone they couldn't see. Some said he'd finally cracked. Others, especially the older guards who'd grown up Catholic, crossed themselves when they walked past his cell. But Shannon didn't care what they thought. He was speaking to someone who answered back, not in words he could hear with his ears, but in dreams that felt more real than waking. One night in early October, Shannon dreamed he was standing in a field of light. The field had no boundaries, no horizon, just endless white gold radiance that didn't hurt to look at. And in the center of that light stood the Virgin Mary, no longer a statue but alive, breathing, her robes moving in a wind he couldn't feel. She smiled at him. Shannon tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come. All the questions he'd been carrying, why this happened, how long he had to endure it, whether justice existed anywhere in the universe, died on his tongue. The Virgin Mary stepped forward and placed her hand over his heart. When she spoke, her voice was like music and thunder, and his mother's voice all at once. Truth cannot die where faith lives, my son. What has been buried will be brought to light. Trust what is coming. Shannon woke with tears streaming down his face, her words echoing in his mind. That morning, when Guard Walsh brought his breakfast, Shannon did something he'd never done before. He looked the guard in the eye and said, "Thank you." Walsh paused, confused. "For what?" "The pamphlet. You saved my life." The guard's face flickered with something, surprise perhaps, or recognition of the weight of what he'd done without meaning to. Then he nodded once, gruffly, and moved on. But both men understood. The messenger had delivered the message, and the condemned man was no longer waiting to die. He was waiting for something else entirely. The notification came on a Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. Shannon was already awake, sitting on his cot with his back against the concrete wall, whispering the Hail Mary for what might have been the 100th time that week. He'd long since memorized every word of the pamphlet Guard Walsh had given him, could recite the prayers forward and backward, but he kept the worn paper folded carefully under his pillow like a talisman. The sound of multiple footsteps echoed down Block E's corridor, not the casual rhythm of a single guard making rounds, but the measured cadence of official business. Shannon knew what it meant before Warden Marcus Keene appeared outside his cell, flanked by 2 senior corrections officers and a man in a state-issued suit carrying a leather folder. The warden was a lean man in his early 60s, with silver hair cropped military short and a face that had learned not to show emotion decades ago. He'd overseen 4 executions during his tenure. Shannon would be the 5th. "Bolton," the warden said, his voice formal but not unkind, "we need you to stand and face the door." Shannon stood slowly, his joints stiff from the cold. Through the narrow slot in the cell door, he could see the man with the leather folder open it and remove a single sheet of paper. Official letterhead, the state seal visible even from where Shannon stood. "Shannon Marcus Bolton," the man read in a monotone that suggested he'd done this before. "By order of the Superior Court and the Office of the Governor, your petition for clemency has been reviewed and denied. Your execution by lethal injection has been scheduled for October 23rd at 6 a.m. You have 24 hours to prepare. Do you understand what I've just told you?" 24 hours. Shannon felt a strange calm settle over him, like a blanket made of snow. He'd known this day would come eventually. 7 years of appeals, all rejected. 7 years of hoping some piece of evidence would surface, some witness would come forward. But the system had made its decision, and the system did not reverse course. "I understand," Shannon said. The warden nodded to the officers, and they began the protocol. Shannon would be moved to a holding cell closer to the execution chamber. He would be allowed to make phone calls, though he had no one to call. He could request a final meal, though the state had imposed strict limitations after previous abuses. He could meet with spiritual advisors. He could write final letters. "Is there anything you need?" Warden Keene asked. It was the first time in 7 years he'd addressed Shannon with something resembling humanity. "Within reason." Shannon was quiet for a long moment. His mind went to the chapel, to the statue with the chipped paint and outstretched hands, to the warmth he'd felt standing before her, the dream that still echoed in his thoughts like a prophecy. Truth cannot die where faith lives. "I want to see the Virgin Mary," Shannon said. The warden's eyebrows rose slightly. "Excuse me?" "The statue, in the chapel." Shannon's voice was steady, certain. "Before they take me to the chamber, I want to kneel before her one more time. I want to pray." The man with the leather folder made a small sound of disapproval. "That's highly irregular." "The chapel isn't part of the standard execution protocol. He can make a request," Warden Keene interrupted, his eyes still on Shannon. "Is that your official final request? To pray in the chapel?" "Yes, sir." The warden studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether this was genuine or some kind of elaborate escape attempt. But Shannon's record was clean. 7 years without violence, without incident, a model prisoner if such a thing existed on death row. "I'll allow it," Keene finally said. 3 a.m., you'll have 15 minutes. Fully restrained, full guard presence. Those are my terms. I accept them. Then God have mercy on your soul, Mr. Bolton. The warden turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until Block E fell back into its usual heavy silence. The holding cell was different from Shannon's regular cell, though not by much, slightly larger, a different view, no window at all, just concrete walls painted institutional beige. A metal desk bolted to the floor where he could write his final statement if he chose. A telephone that connected only to approved numbers, none of which Shannon had any intention of calling. Father Gabriel arrived at noon. The chaplain looked older than Shannon remembered, his silver hair now completely white, deep lines carved into his face from years of bearing other people's burdens. But his eyes were still kind, still steady, as he sat down across from Shannon in the small visiting room. "I heard about your request," Father Gabriel said quietly. "The chapel. Word travels fast. In a prison, everything travels fast." The priest folded his hands on the table between them. "Shannon, I want you to know that I'll be there with you, tonight, in the chapel and afterward. You won't face this alone." Shannon felt something crack in his chest. For 7 years, he'd tried to maintain the stoic discipline the Marine Corps had drilled into him. But sitting across from this man who had visited him every Wednesday for years, who had never stopped believing he was more than the crime they'd convicted him of, the armor finally split. "I didn't kill him, Father," Shannon whispered. "Officer Hanlon, I didn't pull that trigger." "I know," Father Gabriel said simply. "You know, I've always known. A man who prays the way you've been praying these past months isn't a man with murder in his heart." The chaplain leaned forward. "But whether you're guilty or innocent in man's eyes doesn't change what happens next. You'll stand before God and he knows the truth. That's what matters now." Shannon nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "The Virgin Mary," Father Gabriel continued. "Why her specifically?" "My mother," Shannon managed. "She taught me to pray to her. Said she never abandons her warriors. I need—" He paused, searching for words. "I need to believe that's true, that someone's watching, that this all means something." Father Gabriel reached across the table and gripped Shannon's shackled hands. "It means everything," the priest said. "Your faith, your prayers, your refusal to let this place break you. It all means everything. Whatever happens in that chapel tonight, trust that you're not walking into it alone." They prayed together then, Father Gabriel's voice steady and strong, leading them through the rosary while Shannon's voice cracked and faltered and found its way back again. The afternoon crept by with the speed of geological time. Shannon tried to write letters but found he had nothing to say that he hadn't already said in the hundreds of unsent letters under his old cot. He tried to sleep, but found only a strange twilight state, not quite awake, not quite dreaming. At 4 p.m., a guard brought him his final meal. Shannon had requested something simple, his mother's Sunday dinner: fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, sweet tea. The prison kitchen did their best, but it wasn't the same. Nothing could replicate the way his mother had made it, the love baked into every bite. He ate slowly, trying to remember her face, the way she'd hum while cooking, the way she'd make him say grace even when he complained, the way she'd looked at him in that courtroom, her faith in him never wavering even as the world called him a killer. "I'm coming home, Mama," he thought. "Whatever happens tonight, I'm coming home." At 8 p.m., Warden Keene returned with news that made Shannon's heart stutter. "You have a visitor," the warden said. "Specifically requested to be here tonight, as a witness." "Who?" "General Joseph Flacco, your former commanding officer. He arrived an hour ago and asked to be present in the chapel during your prayer time." Shannon felt the air leave his lungs. Flacco. After 7 years of silence, after sitting through the trial with that guilty expression but never speaking up, never confessing, never doing anything to stop what was happening, now he wanted to be present for Shannon's final hours? "Why?" Shannon asked hoarsely. "He didn't say, only that he owed it to you, to be there." The warden paused. "I can deny him entry if you want. This is your time, your request." Shannon's first instinct was to refuse, to tell them to keep Flacco away, to not let the man ease his conscience by witnessing the execution of the Marine whose life he'd destroyed. But then Shannon remembered his dream, the Virgin Mary's words, "Truth cannot die where faith lives." "Let him come," Shannon said quietly. The warden nodded, though his expression suggested he didn't fully understand the decision. The hours between 8 p.m. and 3 a.m. stretched like taffy. Shannon prayed, paced the small cell, prayed some more. His mind kept circling back to Flacco. What could the general possibly have to say after all these years? What absolution could he be seeking in a prison chapel hours before the man he'd betrayed was put to death? At 2:30 a.m., the guards came for him. They shackled his wrists and ankles with the precision of men who'd done this before, though Shannon noticed their hands weren't quite steady. One of them, a young officer Shannon didn't recognize, avoided making eye contact. Another, an older guard named Torres, placed a hand briefly on Shannon's shoulder. "Stay strong, Marine," Torres whispered. The walk from the holding cell to the chapel took less than 5 minutes, but felt like miles. The prison at night was a different world. Emergency lights cast long shadows down empty corridors. The usual cacophony of voices and clanging metal had been replaced by a silence so complete Shannon could hear his own heartbeat. His shackles clinked with each step, a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. They turned a corner, and Shannon saw the chapel doors ahead. Light spilled from the gap beneath them, warm and golden against the cold institutional floor. Through the small windows set in the doors, Shannon could see movement inside, people gathering, witnesses to his final act of faith. The guards slowed as they approached. Warden Keene stood to one side, checking his watch. Father Gabriel waited by the doors, his white collar bright against his black shirt, a rosary wound through his fingers, and standing slightly apart from everyone else, perfectly still, was General Joe Flacco. Shannon's breath caught. Flacco was in full Marine dress blues, the dark jacket with its gold buttons gleaming, the peaked cap, white gloves, ribbons and medals across his chest, bronze star, Purple Heart, combat action ribbon. The uniform of a man who had served with distinction, who had led men into battle and brought them home. But it was Flacco's face that struck Shannon hardest. The general looked like he'd aged 20 years in 7. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with something that looked like it had been eating him alive from the inside out. When his gaze met Shannon's, Shannon saw what he'd seen in the courtroom that final day. Guilt, recognition, and something new, desperate, terrible resolve. Flacco snapped to attention and saluted. It was the salute one Marine gives to another, a gesture of respect, of recognition, of brotherhood. Shannon hadn't been saluted in 7 years. The Corps had abandoned him the moment the verdict came down. But here, in a prison corridor at 2:45 a.m., his former commanding officer rendered honors. Shannon, shackled and condemned, couldn't return it. But he held Flacco's gaze and nodded once. "It's time," Warden Keene said softly. The chapel doors swung open. The room was small, no more than 20 feet square, but it felt vast in the pre-dawn darkness. The pews had been pushed aside. 6 guards lined the walls, their faces impassive but their eyes watchful. Father Gabriel moved to stand near the altar. Flacco took a position near the back. Still at attention, his hands clasped behind his back, and in the corner, illuminated by a single standing lamp, stood the Virgin Mary. The statue looked exactly as Shannon remembered. Chipped paint, outstretched hands, that expression of peace that transcended the cheap plaster she'd been carved from. But in the lamplight, she seemed almost alive. The shadows gave depth to her features. The gold paint on her robe caught the light and held it. Shannon's guards led him forward until he stood 3 feet from the statue. 15 minutes, Warden Keene said. "Starting now." They helped Shannon to his knees. The shackles made it awkward, painful, but he managed. Once down, he clasped his hands together as best he could with the restraints, bowed his head, and began to pray. "Hail Mary, full of grace." His voice was barely a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the chapel, every word carried. Behind him, Father Gabriel joined in, his voice stronger, supporting Shannon's faltering prayer. "The Lord is with thee." Shannon felt tears on his cheeks, but didn't stop. The clock on the wall ticked toward 3 a.m., and in that small chapel, surrounded by guards and witnesses, a condemned Marine prayed to the Virgin Mary one last time, asking not for mercy or miracles, but simply for the truth to be known. Whatever happened next, Shannon thought, his soul was ready. The Virgin Mary stood silent, her plaster hands outstretched, her painted eyes gazing down at the kneeling man before her. And then, at exactly 3 a.m., the lights began to flicker. At first, it was subtle enough to dismiss. The overhead fluorescence stuttered once, twice, like a power surge rippling through the prison's aging electrical system. Guard Torres glanced up at the fixtures, frowning. Warden Keene checked his watch, noting the time in case there was a broader power issue that might delay the execution. But Shannon didn't notice the lights. He was deep in prayer, his eyes closed, his shackled hands pressed together so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The words of the Hail Mary flowed from his lips in a continuous stream, each syllable carrying 7 years of anguish, 7 years of faith tested to its breaking point, 7 years of questions finally surrendering to trust. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners. Father Gabriel's voice wove with his, the priest's decades of practice lending strength to Shannon's trembling prayer. Now and at the hour of our death. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and then they began to dim. Not a sudden blackout, but a gradual fading as though someone were slowly turning down a dimmer switch. The fluorescent fixtures overhead lost their harsh institutional glare, softening to something gentler, warmer. The shadows in the corners of the chapel deepened, but somehow the darkness didn't feel oppressive. It felt expectant. "What the hell?" one of the guards muttered, his hand moving instinctively to his radio. "Hold position," Warden Keene ordered quietly, though his voice carried an edge of uncertainty. His eyes swept the room, looking for the source of the electrical anomaly. But Shannon kept praying. Amen. The word hung in the air like the last note of a hymn. Shannon opened his eyes and lifted his head to look at the statue of the Virgin Mary. And that's when everything changed. The standing lamp beside the statue flickered once, then blazed with light so intense it should have been blinding. But instead of harsh white, the light was golden, the color of honey, of autumn sunlight, of the warmth Shannon remembered from childhood mornings when his mother would wake him for Sunday Mass. The golden light didn't emanate from the lamp. It came from the statue itself. Shannon's breath caught in his throat. The light seemed to be flowing from within the plaster, as though the cheap painted surface had become translucent, revealing something luminous underneath. It spread across the Virgin Mary's robes first, turning the chipped blue paint into flowing sapphire, the faded gold trim into actual gold that rippled like water. "Jesus Christ," Guard Torres whispered, and it wasn't a curse but a prayer. The light climbed higher, illuminating the Virgin Mary's hands. Her outstretched palms began to glow, and Shannon could see, impossible, insane but undeniable, the faint lines of fingerprints in the plaster, as though the statue were becoming flesh before his eyes. Behind Shannon, someone's radio clattered to the floor. The golden radiance reached the Virgin Mary's face, and Shannon felt his heart stop. Her eyes were no longer painted plaster. They were alive, dark and deep and infinite, filled with a compassion so vast it seemed to contain all the suffering of the world and transform it into something beautiful. The eyes looked at Shannon, not through him, not past him, but directly at him with a recognition that stripped away every defense, every wall he'd built to survive 7 years in hell. She saw him, truly saw him. Every broken piece, every moment of despair, every whispered prayer in the darkness. The air in the chapel began to vibrate. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. More like the feeling of standing near a massive bell right as it struck, the way the vibration moves through your bones before your ears can process the tone. But this vibration carried warmth with it, waves of heat that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with presence. The guards along the walls began to react. One dropped to his knees, his mouth open in shock. Another pressed himself against the wall as though trying to disappear into it. Torres had gone completely still, his hand frozen halfway to his weapon, his eyes locked on the statue. The golden light intensified, expanding outward in concentric waves. It touched the altar and the brass candlesticks burst into radiance. It swept across the pews and they seemed to glow from within their grain. It reached the stained glass windows and the faded colors blazed back to life, crimson and sapphire and emerald, depicting scenes of saints and martyrs who suddenly seemed to be moving, their painted hands raised in blessing. "This isn't possible," Warden Keene breathed. His face had drained of all color. This isn't... The light touched him and he fell silent, swaying on his feet. Shannon couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at the Virgin Mary as her entire form became luminous. The plaster seemed to soften, taking on the texture of fabric, of skin, of something real and alive and impossibly present in this concrete room that had witnessed nothing but suffering. And then she spoke. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, not loud, but impossible to ignore, like a whisper spoken directly into Shannon's soul. It was feminine and ancient and young all at once, carrying the weight of eternity and the gentleness of a mother comforting her child. My son. Shannon's tears came freely now, streaming down his face. His whole body shook with the weight of being seen, being known, being called son by something so far beyond his understanding that his mind could barely contain it. Truth cannot die with you. The words from his dream, the prophecy that had sustained him through these final weeks. But hearing them now, spoken not in sleep but in this moment of impossible reality, Shannon understood they weren't just comfort. They were a promise. The Virgin Mary's luminous hand moved, actually moved, the statue's rigid form somehow becoming fluid, and pointed toward the back of the chapel. Shannon followed the gesture, turning his head despite the shackles, despite the guards, despite everything. The Virgin Mary was pointing at General Joe Flacco. The general stood frozen in his dress blues, tears streaming down his weathered face. The medals on his chest caught the golden light and threw it back in 1,000 glittering points. His mouth was open, his eyes wide with terror and wonder and something that looked like relief. The truth, the voice said again, and now it seemed to come from the air itself, resonating in the bones of every person in that chapel. Must be spoken. The light blazed brighter, filling every corner of the room until the walls themselves seemed to disappear and they were all standing in an ocean of golden radiance. The heat intensified, not burning but purifying, like standing in sunlight after years in shadow. Guard Torres collapsed to his knees, openly weeping. Another guard had covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. Even the young officer who had avoided Shannon's eyes earlier was on the ground, prostrate, his lips moving in frantic prayer. Father Gabriel had fallen to his knees beside Shannon, the rosary clutched in his trembling hands. The old priest's face was radiant, tears of joy streaming into his white beard. He was laughing and crying at the same time. And the words that came from his mouth were Latin, ancient prayers Shannon didn't understand, but felt in his marrow. Warden Keene had dropped his clipboard. The official paperwork of execution, the forms and protocols and legal mechanisms of death, scattered across the chapel floor, forgotten and irrelevant in the face of what was happening. The Virgin Mary's eyes found Shannon's again. In them, he saw his mother's face. Rose Bolton, who had walked him to Mass every Sunday, who had whispered promises about faith and protection, who had died believing in his innocence. He saw her, and she smiled at him through the Virgin's radiant expression. "You are not alone," the voice said, tender and absolute. "You have never been alone." Shannon opened his mouth to respond, to say something, anything, but no words would come, and his throat was too tight, his heart too full. All he could do was kneel there in his orange jumpsuit and shackles, bathed in impossible light, and let the tears fall. The golden radiance held for what felt like an eternity and an instant. The air vibrated with presence, with power, with something so fundamentally good that it made Shannon understand, in a way he never had before, what the word holy actually meant. Not religious ceremony or ritual, but this overwhelming goodness that filled every molecule of the air, that made his skin tingle and his chest ache with something too vast for his ribs to contain. And then slowly the light began to fade, not extinguishing but receding like a tide returning to the ocean. The golden radiance pulled back from the walls, from the windows, from the people. It drew inward, concentrating once more around the Virgin Mary's form. Her robes stopped rippling, her hands stilled. Her eyes, those impossible living eyes, began to return to painted plaster. But not completely. Even as the light dimmed, even as the statue settled back into its familiar form, something remained. a faint luminescence around her face, too subtle to be a trick of the lamp but too real to be imagination. A warmth in the air that had nothing to do with the prison's heating system. The overhead fluorescence hummed back to full brightness, harsh and institutional after the golden glow. The chapel fell into absolute silence. Shannon was still on his knees, still staring at the statue, his face wet with tears. The Virgin Mary stood as she always had, chipped paint, outstretched hands, peaceful expression. But Shannon could still feel the imprint of her living gaze on his soul. Around him, the guards were slowly picking themselves up off the floor. Their faces were pale, shocked, transformed. These were men who had seen everything a prison could show them. Violence, despair, death in 100 forms. But they had never seen this. No one had ever seen this. Father Gabriel was clutching his rosary so tightly the beads had left marks on his palms. His voice, when it came, was hoarse with emotion. "Holy Mary, Mother of God." He couldn't finish the prayer, just knelt there, shaking, staring at the statue with an expression of pure wonder. Warden Keene stood like a man who had forgotten how his limbs worked. His mouth opened and closed several times before sound finally emerged. "What?" he whispered. "What just happened?" No one answered. Because there was no answer that would make sense, no explanation that could contain what they had just witnessed. The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of the impossible. And then, from the back of the chapel, a sound broke through. A sob. General Joe Flacco, standing at attention in his immaculate dress blues, his face wet with tears, took one step forward, then another. His whole body was shaking. The metals on his chest caught the fluorescent light as he moved toward Shannon, toward the Virgin Mary, toward the truth that had just been commanded into existence by something far beyond human authority. Flacco's voice cracked. He took another step. "I can't." He fell to his knees in the center of the chapel, and in a voice raw with 7 years of buried guilt, General Joseph Flacco began to confess. "It was my bullet." The words fell into the chapel like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through every person in the room. Shannon's head snapped up. He stared at Flacco, still kneeling in the center of the chapel, the general's dress blues somehow making him look both official and utterly broken. The medals on his chest, symbols of honor, valor, sacrifice, now seemed to weigh him down like chains. "What did you say?" Warden Keene's voice was barely audible. Flacco raised his head. His face was ravaged, tears cutting tracks through what looked like years of suppressed anguish. When he spoke again, his voice was stronger, as though something had broken open inside him, and the words were finally, mercifully, pouring out. "The bullet that killed Officer Marcus Hanlon." Flacco's hands were shaking so violently he pressed them against his thighs to still them. "It was mine. I fired the shot. Not Shannon Bolton. Me." The silence that followed was absolute. Shannon felt the world tilt beneath him. 7 years. 7 years of knowing something was wrong, of feeling the truth hovering just out of reach, of watching Flacco sit in that courtroom with guilt written across his face. And now, in this chapel still warm with the lingering presence of the divine, the truth was finally being spoken. "General Flacco," Warden Keene started, but Flacco cut him off. "No." The word was sharp, commanding, the voice of a man who had led troops into battle and knew how to make himself heard. "No more silence, no more lies. I've carried this for 7 years, and it's destroyed me." "That light." He gestured toward the Virgin Mary statue with a trembling hand. "What we just witnessed. I can't walk out of this room carrying this anymore. I won't." Father Gabriel moved closer, his rosary still clutched in his hands. "General, you understand what you're saying, the legal implications." "I understand perfectly, Father." Flacco's voice cracked but held. "I'm confessing to manslaughter, to conspiracy, to letting an innocent man sit on death row for a crime I committed." He turned his gaze to Shannon, and in his eyes was an agony so deep it was almost unbearable to witness. "I'm confessing to betraying the finest Marine I ever had the honor of commanding." Shannon couldn't speak. His throat had closed entirely. Flacco took a shuddering breath and began to explain. March 2018, 3 years after Shannon returned from his second deployment. I was still active duty, working with the Criminal Investigation Division on a case that had been building for months. His voice steadied as he slipped into the cadence of a military briefing, as though facts and details were easier than emotion. We'd discovered a weapons smuggling operation. Someone inside the Marine Corps was stealing equipment, small arms, ammunition, tactical gear, and selling it through civilian channels. He paused, his jaw working. The trail led to a task force operating out of North Carolina, local police working with corrupt supply officers. Officer Marcus Hanlon was one of the central players. Guard Torres, still on his knees near the wall, made a sound of disbelief. Hanlon was dirty? Dirty doesn't begin to cover it. Flacco's voice hardened. He was moving thousands of rounds of ammunition every month, military-grade weapons ending up in the hands of gang members, drug dealers, anyone with cash. People died because of what he was doing. Marines died when their supply shipments came up short in theater. Shannon's mind reeled. The confrontation in the parking lot, Hanlon's accusation about the storage depot, about seeing Shannon meet someone in the dark. It was all starting to make horrible sense. I needed someone I could trust, Flacco continued. Someone with the skills to help me recover evidence without spooking Hanlon and his network. Shannon was the obvious choice. Honorable, capable, loyal to the core. His voice broke on the last word. I asked him to meet Hanlon that night. Told him I'd be there as backup. The plan was to get Hanlon to lead us to the stolen weapons cache. But something went wrong, Father Gabriel said softly. Everything went wrong. Flacco pressed his palms against his eyes as though he could push back the memories. Hanlon must have suspected something. He approached Shannon outside the bar, confrontational, aggressive. I was watching from my vehicle, waiting for the signal to move in. But Hanlon escalated faster than we anticipated. He grabbed Shannon. They struggled. The chapel was so quiet Shannon could hear his own heartbeat. I got out of my vehicle, moved toward them. I shouted for them to separate, but Hanlon had already gone for his weapon. Flacco's voice dropped to barely a whisper. I saw him draw, saw his finger move to the trigger. He was going to shoot Shannon. I know he was. So I drew my weapon and I fired. A guard near the door let out a long, shaky breath. I was aiming for his shoulder, his arm, anywhere that would stop him without killing him. But he moved. Shannon pushed him, trying to disarm him, and Hanlon twisted. Flacco's words came faster now, desperate. The bullet hit his chest, center mass. He went down and I knew it was fatal. The exit wound, the blood, Shannon remembered. The impossibly fast spreading of blood on the asphalt, the way Hanlon's chest rose twice and stopped. He'd thought it was strange at the time, that single gunshot causing so much damage so quickly, because it hadn't been the weapon Hanlon was carrying. It had been a higher caliber, military issue. I panicked, Flacco said, and the admission seemed to cost him everything. I panicked like a coward. I should have stayed, should have called it in, taken responsibility, explained what happened, but all I could think was, the investigation. If I'm arrested, the whole operation falls apart. The smuggling ring escapes. Hanlon dies a hero instead of a criminal. So you ran, Warden Keene said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only stunned comprehension. I ran. I got back in my vehicle, and I drove away while Shannon was still trying to save Hanlon's life. Flacco's face twisted with anguish. By the time I realized what I'd done, what I'd set in motion, it was too late. Shannon's prints were on Hanlon's weapon from the struggle. The witness who heard shouting and saw Shannon standing over the body, the prosecution building their case. You could have come forward, Father Gabriel said quietly. At any point during the trial, I told myself I would. Flacco's voice rose, cracking with emotion. Every day of that trial, I sat in that courtroom and told myself this was the day I'd stand up and tell the truth. But then they'd bring in another witness, present another piece of evidence, and I'd think, they'll figure it out. Someone will realize it doesn't add up. Shannon will be acquitted, and I'll finish the investigation, and justice will be served. He laughed bitterly. Justice. I spent 25 years in the Marine Corps believing in justice, honor, truth, and when it mattered most, I was a coward. Shannon found his voice at last. It came out rough, barely more than a whisper. The smuggling ring. Did you stop them? Flacco nodded slowly. 3 months after your conviction, we arrested 14 people, recovered over $200,000 in stolen equipment, put a major trafficking operation out of business. He met Shannon's eyes. But what does any of that matter? What good did it do when I bought it with your life? 7 years, Guard Torres said, and his voice was shaking. You let him sit here for 7 years? I visited every month, Flacco said hollowly. Did you know that? I'd drive here, sit in the parking lot, and stare at the building. Told myself I was checking on him, making sure he was okay, but I was really checking on my own guilt, trying to convince myself that letting one Marine take the fall to save dozens of others was the right call. Was it? Shannon asked. The question wasn't angry, just tired, infinitely tired. No, Flacco's voice was absolute. No, it wasn't. There is no mission, no operation, no tactical objective worth the cost of honor. I learned that in Iraq. I forgot it here. He straightened his shoulders, and for a moment he looked like the general he'd been, the leader Shannon had once trusted with his life. That's why I'm here tonight, why I requested to witness your execution. I couldn't let you die alone. Couldn't let you face that knowing I'd sent you there and stayed silent. You were going to confess, Father Gabriel said with sudden understanding. After the execution. Yes. Flacco's voice was hollow. I was going to wait until it was over, until Shannon was gone and couldn't be brought back, and then I was going to turn myself in. Let them arrest me, charge me, destroy whatever was left of my career and reputation. I thought that was the honorable thing, to give you back your name after you were gone. But then the Virgin Mary spoke. Father Gabriel finished quietly. Flacco nodded, fresh tears streaming down his face. She pointed at me. That voice, God help me, that voice. It said the truth must be spoken. And I knew. I knew I couldn't wait. Couldn't let Shannon die believing the world thought he was a killer. The truth had to come out now, while he could still hear it. He turned to Warden Keene, straightening to his full height despite the tears on his face. Warden Marcus Keene, I am confessing under oath and in the presence of witnesses to the killing of Officer Marcus Hanlon on March 15, 2018. I acted in defense of Sergeant Shannon Bolton, but I fled the scene and allowed an innocent man to be convicted of my crime. I am prepared to face all legal consequences of my actions. Warden Keene looked like a man who had stepped into an alternate reality. His hand moved to his radio, then stopped. He looked at the Virgin Mary statue, still faintly luminous in the corner, at Father Gabriel, his face radiant with emotion, at the guards lining the walls, every one of them witnesses to both the confession and the miracle that had preceded it. This is... Keene's voice failed him. He tried again. This is unprecedented. Warden, Father Gabriel stepped forward. You have a man scheduled for execution in less than 3 hours. An execution based on evidence that has just been revealed as incomplete, as false. The priest's voice grew stronger. You have a confession from the actual shooter. You have witnesses, myself, these guards, you yourself who can testify to what was said in this room. And what happened in this room, Guard Torres added, his voice shaking. Sir, we all saw it, that light, that voice, whatever it was a miracle, Father Gabriel said simply. Call it what it is. We witnessed a miracle, and we witnessed the truth it demanded. Warden Keene looked at Shannon, still kneeling in his shackles, his face wet with tears, looking more alive than he had in 7 years. Governor Hayes needs to know about this, Keene said finally. Immediately. He pulled out his radio, then paused, looking around the chapel one more time, at the statue of the Virgin Mary with her peaceful expression and outstretched hands, at the guards who had fallen to their knees in awe, at General Flacco in his dress blues, standing at attention as though facing a court-martial, at Shannon Bolton, the condemned man who might, by grace and truth, still have a chance at freedom. This is Warden Keene, he spoke into the radio, his voice steady despite everything. I need an immediate emergency line to the governor's office. Do not, I repeat, do not proceed with any execution preparations. We have a situation that requires immediate intervention at the highest level. Static crackled. A confused voice responded. Sir, it's 3:30 a.m. The governor... Wake him. Keene's voice was iron. Tell him there's been a confession. Tell him... He looked at the Virgin Mary statue again. Tell him something happened here tonight that he needs to hear about personally. As Keene moved toward the chapel doors to make the call, Father Gabriel knelt beside Shannon. "Breathe," the priest whispered. "Just breathe. The truth is out now. Let it do its work." Shannon drew in a shuddering breath, then another. Across the chapel, General Flacco was still standing at attention, tears continuing to stream down his face, but his expression had changed. The suffocating guilt that had hollowed him out for 7 years had lifted, replaced by something that looked like peace, the same peace Shannon saw on the Virgin Mary's face. Outside the chapel, dawn was still 2 hours away, but in Block E of the North Carolina Correctional Facility, the darkness had already begun to lift. Truth, it turned out, was its own kind of light. Governor Marcus Hayes arrived at the prison at 4:47 a.m., still wearing his pajama top under a hastily thrown-on suit jacket. He listened to Warden Keene's account in stunned silence, listened to Father Gabriel describe the golden light, the living eyes of the statue, the voice that had commanded truth. Listened to Guard Torres and the other officers corroborate every detail, their voices shaking but certain. And finally, he listened to General Joseph Flacco repeat his confession, word for word, while a court stenographer took down every syllable. By 5:30 a.m., less than 30 minutes before Shannon Bolton was scheduled to die, Governor Hayes signed an emergency stay of execution. Shannon remained in the holding cell while the machinery of justice, so efficient at condemning, so cumbersome at correcting, ground slowly into motion. The investigation took 3 weeks. Federal investigators, state prosecutors, and military criminal investigators descended on the case like archaeologists excavating a long-buried truth. What they found confirmed every word of Flacco's confession. Ballistics reports that had been conveniently overlooked during the original trial showed the fatal bullet came from a military-issue M9 pistol, not Hanlon's standard police sidearm. Security footage from the storage depot Shannon had visited that night showed him meeting with a military vehicle, Flacco's vehicle, at exactly the time Flacco claimed. Cell phone records proved Flacco had been in the area of Murphy's Tap when Hanlon was killed, and most damning of all, buried in a locked file cabinet in Flacco's home office. Investigators found a service weapon that ballistics matched to the bullet that killed Marcus Hanlon. The general had kept it all these years, unable to dispose of the evidence, unable to fully escape what he'd done. Officer Hanlon's corruption was confirmed as well. Bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, storage units filled with military equipment, text messages coordinating sales with known criminals. The man who had been lionized as a fallen hero was revealed as a traitor who had profited from the same uniform he'd once worn. On a cold morning in early November, Shannon Bolton walked out of the North Carolina Correctional Facility a free man. He'd been inside for 7 years, 4 months, and 11 days. He emerged 45 years old, his hair graying at the temples, his body lean from years of prison food and confined exercise. But his eyes, the eyes that had witnessed both the depths of human injustice and the heights of divine grace, were clear. A small crowd had gathered outside the prison gates, news cameras, reporters shouting questions, and standing slightly apart from the media circus, Father Gabriel in his black shirt and white collar, waiting with the patient smile of a man who had never stopped believing. Shannon walked straight to him. The two men embraced without words, the priest's small frame nearly disappearing in Shannon's arms. "Welcome home," Father Gabriel whispered. "Thank you," Shannon said, "for everything, for every Wednesday. I did nothing. You did the work." The priest pulled back, his eyes bright. "And she did the rest." The media frenzy exploded within hours. Death row. Marine freed after miracle in prison. Chapel Virgin Mary. Statue glows during condemned man's prayer. General confesses the miracle in Block E. Divine intervention or mass hallucination. The story spread like wildfire. News networks aired interviews with the guards who had witnessed the light. Father Gabriel appeared on morning shows carefully describing what he'd seen while refusing to speculate on its source. "I know what I witnessed," he would say simply. "Call it what you will. I call it grace." The church sent investigators. A team of theologians, scientists, and diocesan officials descended on the prison chapel. They examined the Virgin Mary statue from every angle. They tested the paint for phosphorescent compounds. They checked the electrical systems for malfunctions that could have caused the lights to flicker. They interviewed every guard, every witness, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. They found none. The statue showed no chemical reason for luminescence. The electrical system had no faults. and every witness, despite being interviewed separately, described the same event in remarkable detail. Golden light, living eyes, a voice that spoke of truth, warmth that felt like presence. Dr. Sarah Chen, a physicist from Duke University brought in to consult, examined the statue for 3 days straight. Her final report was frustratingly brief. No natural mechanism can explain the reported phenomenon. The statue shows no signs of artificial lighting, chemical treatment, or structural modification. If the witnesses are credible, and I have no reason to doubt their credibility, then what occurred in that chapel falls outside our current understanding of physical law. The Diocese of Raleigh, after careful deliberation, issued a statement. While we cannot definitively declare this event a miracle in the canonical sense, we acknowledge that something extraordinary occurred in the presence of multiple witnesses. We encourage the faithful to see in this event a reminder that God's grace can penetrate even the darkest places, and that truth, no matter how long buried, will ultimately be brought to light. The statue itself became a pilgrimage site. The prison warden, after consulting with the diocese and state officials, agreed to open the chapel for supervised visits. People came from across the country, the faithful seeking blessing, the curious seeking answers, the suffering seeking hope. And the statue, now encased in protective glass, continued to emit a faint warmth that no instrument could measure, but everyone who stood before it could feel. 3 weeks after his release, Shannon stood in a military courtroom at Camp Lejeune. General Joseph Flacco's court-martial had been swift and thorough. He'd pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter, obstruction of justice, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The military prosecutors had recommended 15 years in a federal prison. His defense attorney, a young JAG officer who looked overwhelmed by the case, had argued for leniency given his confession and cooperation. The sentence came down that morning, 10 years, with possibility of parole after 7. But before Flacco was led away, before the guards took him to begin serving his time, the judge granted an unusual request. Shannon had asked to speak. The courtroom fell silent as Shannon approached the bench. He wore a simple suit, his first civilian clothes in years that weren't prison-issued. His posture was military straight, his bearing unmistakable even without a uniform. "Permission to address General Flacco," Shannon said. The judge nodded. Shannon turned to face the man who had destroyed his life and ultimately saved it. Flacco stood between 2 guards, no longer in dress blues but in a plain green uniform, all insignia and medals removed. He'd been stripped of his rank that morning in a private ceremony. Joseph Flacco was no longer a general. He was simply a convicted criminal awaiting transport. But when Shannon approached, Flacco straightened to attention. The 2 men looked at each other across the years of betrayal and guilt, across the chasm of what had been lost and what had been found. "Sir," Shannon said quietly, and the word carried no irony, no bitterness. "I want you to know something." Flacco's jaw tightened, bracing for judgment. "You kept your oath," Shannon continued. "Not when it was easy, not when it was convenient, but when it mattered most, when heaven itself demanded truth, you kept your oath. You chose honor over self-preservation. That's what a Marine does." Flacco's eyes filled with tears. Shannon reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and silver. His dog tags. The ones blessed by a chaplain in Iraq, the ones his mother had returned to him before his deployment, the ones he'd clutched while praying in his cell for 7 years. He held them out. "These have seen me through 2 wars and 1 execution," Shannon said. "They've been blessed by God and tested by hell. I want you to have them. To remember that redemption is real, that honor can be reclaimed, that you're still a Marine, even if they've taken the rank." Flacco's hands trembled as he took the dog tags. He clutched them to his chest, unable to speak. And then, despite the guards on either side of him, despite the chains on his wrists, Joseph Flacco raised his right hand in a perfect salute. Not the salute of a general to a subordinate, but the salute of one Marine to another. Equal. Brothers. Bound by something deeper than rank or race or the mistakes that had nearly destroyed them both. Shannon returned the salute. In that moment, something shifted in the courtroom. The same military system that had failed Shannon, but that had allowed corruption and cowardice to send an innocent man to death row, was now acknowledging its wrong. Through Flacco's salute, stripped of rank but rich with meaning, the institution itself was bowing before truth. The guards led Flacco away. He looked back once, the dog tag still clutched in his hand, mouthing two words: "Thank you." 6 months later, Shannon stood in a community center in East Raleigh, addressing a room full of veterans. Some were homeless, some were battling addiction. Several were navigating the criminal justice system, caught in the same web of PTSD, poverty, and circumstance that had nearly killed Shannon. All of them had heard about the Marine who had been condemned to die and walked free through grace and truth. "My name is Shannon Bolton," he began, as he did at every meeting. "And I'm here to tell you that no matter how dark it gets, no matter how buried the truth seems, faith is the last freedom they can't chain." This was the Bolton Brothers Initiative. Part support group, part advocacy organization, part ministry. Shannon had founded it with Father Gabriel's help, funded by donations and speaking engagements. They mentored veterans through legal troubles, addiction recovery, and post-traumatic stress. They advocated for criminal justice reform. They visited prisons, bringing hope to men and women who thought they'd been forgotten. And at every meeting, in every facility, Shannon told his story, not to glorify himself, but to point to something greater. "I knelt before the Virgin Mary in a prison chapel," he would say, "and she spoke truth into existence. If God can break through steel and concrete to save one guilty-looking innocent man, he can reach you too. Wherever you are, whatever you've done, you are not forgotten." The Bolton Brothers Initiative grew, first dozens of veterans, then hundreds. Churches partnered with them. The VA began referring cases to them. Even the military, eager to repair its tarnished image, quietly supported their work. And Shannon, who had once been condemned as a killer, became known as something else entirely: a witness, a messenger, a living reminder that miracles still happen in the darkest places on earth. In his wallet, he carried a small laminated card. On it was a prayer, printed on cheap paper, from a pamphlet that guard Henry Walsh had slipped into his cell 7 years ago. "Hail Mary, full of grace." And every night before sleep, Shannon would whisper those words into the darkness, grateful to still be alive to speak them. 3 years after his release, Shannon Bolton returned to the place that should have been his tomb. The North Carolina Correctional Facility looked different in the autumn afternoon light. Less oppressive somehow, though the razor wire still gleamed and the guard towers still loomed. Or perhaps it was Shannon who had changed, who could now see these walls not as the place where he'd nearly died, but as the place where he'd been reborn. Warden Keene met him at the main gate. The warden had aged in the 3 years since that miraculous night, his silver hair now white, new lines carved deep around his eyes. But he smiled warmly as he shook Shannon's hand. "Welcome back, Mr. Bolton," Keene said. "Though I imagine those are words you never expected to hear." "No, sir," Shannon replied. "Can't say I did." They walked through the security checkpoints together, Shannon surrendering his phone and keys just as he'd done 1,000 times before, though now he would get them back. Guards who had once watched him with wary suspicion now nodded respectfully. A few even smiled. One, Guard Torres, now promoted to sergeant, clasped Shannon's hand briefly as they passed. "Good to see you on this side of the bars, brother," Torres said quietly. The prison had changed in small ways. Fresh paint in the corridors, new LED lights replacing the old flickering fluorescents, a mural on one wall depicting the Blue Ridge Mountains, painted by inmates in the art therapy program, a program that hadn't existed 3 years ago. But they were walking towards something that had changed even more profoundly. "We've had over 50,000 visitors," Warden Keene said as they approached Block E. "People from all over the world, priests, rabbis, imams, scientists, journalists, skeptics. Every one of them wants to see the chapel, to see her." "And?" Shannon asked. Keene paused before answering. "And most of them leave different than they arrived. I can't explain it, Mr. Bolton. I've run prisons for 30 years. I know what these places do to people. They're designed to contain, to punish, to break. But that chapel..." He shook his head. Something changed that night, and it hasn't changed back. They rounded the final corner. The chapel door stood open, warm light spilling into the corridor. Through the doorway, Shannon could see people inside, a small group of visitors, heads bowed, some kneeling. An older woman with a rosary wound through her fingers, a young man in a wheelchair, a priest in traditional vestments leading them in quiet prayer. We allow visits twice a day now, Keene explained. Morning and evening, groups of no more than 12 at a time. Father Gabriel supervises most of them personally. As if summoned by his name, the elderly priest appeared in the doorway. Father Gabriel's hair had gone completely white, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of someone whose bones had begun to protest the years. But his eyes, those kind, knowing eyes, were bright as ever. "Shannon," he said, opening his arms. They embraced in the doorway, and Shannon felt something release in his chest. This man had visited him every Wednesday for years, had knelt beside him during the miracle, had never wavered in his belief that truth would prevail. "Thank you for coming," Father Gabriel said. "She's been waiting for you." The current group of visitors was finishing their time. They filed out slowly, reverently, several of them nodding to Shannon as they passed. The older woman paused to take his hand. "You're him," she whispered. "The Marine, the one who prayed." "Yes, ma'am. My son is in prison, 20 years for something he says he didn't do." Her eyes glistened with tears. "But after coming here, after praying before her, I have hope again. Thank you for showing us that miracles are real." Shannon squeezed her hand gently. "Keep praying, ma'am. Truth has a way of finding the light." When the last visitor had gone, Father Gabriel gestured toward the chapel. "Go ahead, take your time. I'll wait outside." Shannon stepped through the doorway alone. The chapel had been transformed. Not structurally, it was still the same small room with wooden pews and faded stained glass, but someone had cared for it. The floors gleamed with polish. Fresh flowers adorned the altar, white lilies and blue irises. Candles flickered in brass holders, their flames steady and bright. And in the corner, exactly where she had always stood, was the Virgin Mary. The statue was now encased in a glass enclosure, protection from overzealous pilgrims, Shannon supposed, or perhaps just acknowledgement of her significance. But the glass couldn't contain what emanated from her. The light. It was subtle, barely perceptible in the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. But Shannon could see it, a faint, golden luminescence around her face, her hands, the folds of her robe. Not bright enough to illuminate the room, but present enough that anyone who looked closely would know something remained. Something that defied explanation, that had persisted for 3 years despite every attempt to rationalize it away. Shannon approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the empty chapel. As he drew closer, he felt it again, that warmth, that presence, the same sensation he'd felt the night he'd knelt here in shackles, hours from death, and witnessed the impossible. She looked exactly as he remembered, chipped paint and all. But her eyes, even rendered in faded plaster, seemed to follow him with the same compassion, the same knowing, that had seen into his soul 3 years ago. Shannon knelt before the glass enclosure, not because he was forced to, not because guards surrounded him or shackles bound him, but because his legs simply gave out under the weight of gratitude, of awe, of everything this moment represented. He was free, standing in a place that should have been his grave, kneeling not as a condemned man, but as a witness to grace. "Thank you," he whispered, "for seeing me, for speaking truth, for not letting me die believing I was forgotten." The statue, of course, didn't answer, not with words, but Shannon felt the warmth intensify slightly, like a gentle hand on his shoulder, like his mother's touch when she would wake him for Sunday Mass all those years ago. He prayed then, not for himself, he'd been given more than he could have hoped for, but for others, for the men still locked in Block E, still waiting for their own truth to surface, for the families outside who believed in their innocence, for guards like Henry Walsh who unknowingly became messengers of hope, for generals like Flacco who carried the weight of their choices. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," Shannon prayed, "pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen." When he finally stood, his knees aching from the hard floor, he noticed something new on the chapel wall. A bronze plaque had been mounted beside the entrance. Engraved in simple letters were words Shannon had spoken during one of his first talks at the Bolton Brothers Initiative, words that had been quoted in news articles, shared on social media, painted on murals across the country. "Faith is the last freedom they can't chain. Shannon Bolton, United States Marine Corps." Below it, in smaller text, "In memory of the miracle witnessed in this chapel on October 23, 2021, when truth was spoken and grace made manifest. May all who enter here remember that no soul is beyond redemption and no truth is forever buried." Shannon traced the letters with his fingers, remembering the cell where those words had first formed, remembering the 7 years of darkness that had taught him their meaning. Father Gabriel appeared in the doorway. "The diocese wanted to put up a statue of you," he said with a gentle smile. "I convinced them that a simple plaque would be more appropriate. Thank you for that." "You're not the miracle, Shannon. You're the witness to it. There's a difference." The old priest moved to stand beside him, both of them looking at the Virgin Mary. "Though I suppose we're all witnesses now. Everyone who was in this room that night, everyone who's visited since, we carry the story forward." "Have you heard from him?" Shannon asked quietly. "From Flacco?" Father Gabriel nodded. "I visit him monthly. He's in a federal facility in Virginia, medical wing now." Shannon turned sharply. "Medical wing?" "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. They diagnosed it 6 months ago." The priest's voice was gentle. "He's dying, Shannon. The doctors give him perhaps another month, 2 at most." Shannon felt the news settle in his chest like a stone. Is he at peace?" "More than I've ever seen him. He spends his days writing letters, mostly to you, though he's never sent them. Says he doesn't want to burden you with his dying." Father Gabriel reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope. "But he asked me to give you this. He said if you ever came back to the chapel, you should have it." Shannon took the envelope with trembling hands. His name was written on the front in handwriting that had grown shaky with illness. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Flacco's distinctive script. The writing wandered across the page, some lines strong, others barely legible, as though he'd written it over many days as strength allowed. "Shannon, by the time you read this, I'll likely be gone. The doctors tell me the cancer is aggressive, but I'm not afraid. I've had 3 years to make my peace, 3 years more than I gave you. I write to you from a prison cell, and I finally understand what you endured. The walls, the silence, the slow erosion of everything you once were. But I also understand something else, that faith you spoke of in your work with the Bolton brothers, that last freedom they can't chain. I found it here, Shannon. In this cell, in these final months, I found the same grace you found. Father Gabriel brings me communion every week. We pray together, and sometimes I know this will sound impossible, but after what we witnessed in that chapel, I know you'll believe me. Sometimes I feel her presence, the Virgin Mary, that same warmth, that same peace. I saw grace in a death cell, Shannon. Yours first, and now mine. I saw it interrupt an execution and demand truth. I saw it transform a prison into a shrine, and I see it now as my body fails, reminding me that no sin is beyond forgiveness when we finally surrender to truth. You gave me your dog tags. I wear them still, even here, buried. They remind me that honor can be reclaimed, that redemption is real, that I am still a Marine, even stripped of rank, even dying in prison for my crimes. Thank you for your forgiveness. Thank you for showing me that grace is stronger than guilt, and thank you for continuing the mission, saving Marines, saving veterans, saving souls that the world has condemned. Semper Fidelis, brother, always faithful. Until we meet again in the presence of she who spoke truth. Joseph Flacco. Shannon's hands shook as he read. Tears blurred the words, but he blinked them clear, reading to the end. He wanted you to know, Father Gabriel said softly, that your forgiveness saved him. Not from prison, not from death, but from the prison of his own guilt. That's a greater miracle than any light, Shannon. You gave him back his soul. Shannon folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. When it happens, will you let me know? Of course. And Shannon? The priest's hand rested on his shoulder. He requested that you be there, at the end, if you're willing. Shannon looked at the Virgin Mary, at the faint golden glow that had persisted for 3 years, that showed no signs of fading. He thought of Flacco kneeling in that courtroom, saluting despite his chains, of the dog tags that had seen 2 wars and 1 execution, now offering comfort to a dying man. I'll be there, Shannon said. A Marine doesn't leave his brothers behind. The light in the chapel was fading as afternoon gave way to evening. The autumn sun slanted through the stained glass windows, casting patterns of crimson and gold across the floor. Shannon stood before the Virgin Mary one final time, committing this moment to memory. The statue remained as she had always been. Chipped paint, outstretched hands, peaceful expression, and that inexplicable, impossible, persistent glow, faint as candlelight, steady as a heartbeat, present as grace. "People ask me all the time," Shannon said to Father Gabriel as they prepared to leave, "if I'm angry, if I resent the 7 years they took from me. And what do you tell them?" "I tell them that those 7 years taught me something I could never have learned in freedom, that when everything is stripped away, reputation, liberty, hope, faith remains. And that's enough." He looked once more at the statue. "I tell them I knelt before the Virgin Mary as a condemned man, and I stand before her now as a witness. And that makes all the difference." They walked toward the chapel doors together. As Shannon crossed the threshold, he paused and looked back one final time. The Virgin Mary stood in her glass enclosure, bathed in the last golden light of day. And for just a moment, impossible to prove, impossible to deny, Shannon could have sworn he saw her smile. Outside, the prison went about its evening routine. Doors closing, counts being taken, men locked in cells, counting down their own sentences. But in the chapel, something else was being counted. Miracles, witnesses, souls touched by the impossible and transformed by truth. The light continued to glow, faint but eternal, a reminder that heaven had broken through these walls once and left something of itself behind. Faith, it turned out, was indeed the last freedom they couldn't chain. And in a prison chapel in North Carolina, that freedom glowed golden, 3 years running, with no sign of fading, ever. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from.